Welcome everybody to the Real Left Forum, and in particular the Marxist-Humanist Initiative's video panels for the cancelled Left Forum. Marxist-Humanist Initiative decided to go ahead with its panels because today's political, economic and environmental crisis present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. The first panel, which was recorded yesterday, is entitled "The Poverty of Populism, a Marxist-Humanist Critique of Redistributionist Politics." This is our second panel, enabled Marxist-Humanist perspectives on the life and death battle against Trumpism. I will be your chair for today. My name is Keller. We have three panelists who will be giving a talk. The first one is Jaclard, who has been organizational secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative since its founding in 2009, and has been practicing Marxist-Humanism for more than 50 years. Anne's talk is entitled "Desperation is Driving the Trumpite Republican Party. Prepare for the Worst." Then we have Plante, who is a New York City student working politically with Marxist-Humanist Initiative, researching the rise of right-wing populism and the state of liberal democracy in the West. Adam's talk is entitled "When Left is Rightist, Left-Wing Reactionaries Bolster Trumpist Threat." Last but not least, we have Ravi, a London-based housing activist who works with Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Ravi's talk is entitled "Trumpism, Labourism and Nationalism." Before we start the talks, please allow me to take a moment to introduce Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI for short, aims to contribute to the transformation of the capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and the further development of Marxist-Humanism as articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization, in which mass movements striving for freedom take hold of Marx's philosophy and freedom and recreate society on a new basis. MHI believes that today's political, economic, and environmental crisis presents a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposition to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on production of value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interest separate from theirs. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it, as well as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice. Okay, our three panelists will now speak for 20 minutes each, followed by a brief period of discussion and comments. Panelists, please will you note that the 20 minutes will be strictly enforced, and that I will give you a 3-minute cue or warning before your time is up. Okay. If Anne Jaclard is ready, I would like to hand over to her. Anne will speak on desperation is driving the Trumpite Republican Party. Prepare for the worst.
Thank you, Rav. I'm speaking about the increasingly desperate measures and draconian attacks on the American people that are coming from the dominant section of the ruling class, the Trumpite Republican Party, as it tries to hang on to control of the U.S. political system. My thesis is that the party's vicious actions, even when they hurt Trump's popularity among voters from outside his base, whom he needs in order to win the election, these are actually necessary measures in order for the party to survive. That is because changing demographics may soon render the party incapable of winning, quote, normal elections, assuming the U.S. remains a democracy and holds normal elections. Here's why. For some time now, most non-Hispanic whites, to use the Census Bureau category, have voted Republican, while most people of color have voted Democratic. But the population is changing. As the non-Hispanic whites' share of the electorate becomes smaller and smaller relative to the share of people of color, it will become increasingly difficult for any Republican to win the presidency, even if all the non-Hispanic whites in the electorate were to vote Republican. Therefore, the party must take drastic measures to hang on to power, not only this year when Trump is unpopular, but forevermore. Therein lies the gravest threat to U.S. democracy. I will now explicate the demographics at the heart of this paper, and then I'll turn to Trumpite efforts at, quote, solutions which we must fight to save our lives. Republicans soon may not be able to win a, quote, normal election. Trumpite attacks on people of color are undoubtedly motivated by the largely true assumption that most people of color will not vote for Trump or for other Republicans. Even if in the future the party runs less odious candidates than Trump, or makes a return to hypothetical traditional Republican values, it will still become increasingly difficult over time for that party to win elections. This is because the makeup of the population is changing, and the Republicans can't do a lot to stop the change. In a word, demographics are the death knell of the Republicans. They can try to slow its effects by eliminating immigration altogether, by trying to change birthright citizenship or other drastic measures, but it's only a matter of time before the current majority of voters, the, quote, non-Hispanic whites, gives way to a new majority composed of African American, Latinx, and other non-white people, and those people mostly vote Democratic. The bottom line is that if the U.S. remains more or less democratic republic rather than turning into a dictatorship, the Republican Party will be finished. Let's look at the facts and figures. The chart marked A shows the percentage of whites, blacks, Latinx, and Asians who voted for the Republican presidential candidates from 2000 to 2016. The white percentage is at or close to 60%. The black percentage is never more than 10%. The chart, chart A, which is on top of my picture, do we know that, Mr. Tech? Or maybe it's somewhere else on your screen, but on mine it's over on top of my picture. The chart reveals two striking facts. First, among all four racial and ethnic groups on the chart, white, black, Latinx, and Asians, the percentage that voted Republican remained within a narrow range during those 5 elections held over the 16-year period. Second, of course, we see there are huge differences among the group's voting behavior. In fact, a large differential among the 4 groups has existed for decades. We only start with 2000 here, but the last time a Democratic presidential candidate won the majority of the white vote was 1964. Meanwhile, in this century, a minority and a shrinking minority of Latinx and Asians have voted Republican, and the fraction of the blacks who vote Republican has consistently been tiny. There's every reason to think this trend will continue, especially in light of the past and current racism practiced by the Republican Party. If the differentials between white and non-white voters do remain basically unchanged, what factor might be expected to change outcomes of elections? It appears unlikely that the outcomes will change because of attempts to persuade people to change parties. Rather, changes in the shares of the total vote cast by non-Hispanic whites and by non-whites, which includes Latinx, are what is most likely to change future outcomes. Let's look at chart B, where we see the actual changes in the racial and ethnic compositions of the U.S. population from 1960 through 2010 and the projected trends from 2020 forward. We can see that the percentage of the population that was white declined consistently since 1970, and its decline is projected to continue. This is mirrored by modest growth in the share of the population that is black and very rapid growth in the Latinx share. Both trends are also projected to continue through the half-century following 2010. Thus, in Chart A, we find the percentage of racial and ethnic groups voting Republican remains consistent, while in Chart B, we see the share of the population comprised of whites, blacks, and Latinx has been changing dramatically. For an even more dramatic representation of the change, let's look at Chart C. Whereas B includes all, quote, whites, C employs different racial ethnic definitions. C refers specifically to, quote, non-Hispanic whites, the core of the Republican electorate. As chart C shows, non-Hispanic whites made up 80% of the population as recently as 1980, where the chart begins, but by 2010 their share of the population had fallen to 64%, and they are projected to become a minority of the population, these whites, by the mid-2040s. The largest factor contributing to this decline in the white share is the quick growth of the Hispanic population. It was only 6% of the total in 1980, but rose to 16% by 2010, and is projected to rise to about 25% by the mid-2040s. Putting these demographic trends together with the fact that relatively few people of color vote Republican, we can see how an increase in the non-white share of the total threatens the Republicans' ability to win elections. So the party is dying simply because whites will make up a smaller and smaller percentage of the electorate. Trump and the Trumpite Party are terrified. We see that for the Republican Party to survive, it is left with a choice between broadening its appeal beyond non-Hispanic white voters or suppressing the vote of non-whites. Because the party is under the control of its Trumpite base and it must employ racism and xenophobia to please that base, the racism and xenophobia only gets worse, and non-whites will continue to reject the party. Changes in the shares of the population are happening so rapidly that if we look ahead about 25 years, even if the entire non-Hispanic white population, all the whites, were to vote Republican, that wouldn't enable the Republican Party to win national elections without adding votes of some of the non-white population. So without extreme voter suppression and elimination of significant numbers of non-white voters, Black, Brown, Native American, and Asian voters will eventually become decisive to the outcome of elections in perpetuity. Recently, large numbers of whites, especially white youth, have demonstrated that they reject racism. The movement for Black lives has been genuinely multiracial, and this only accentuates the starkness of the choice that the Republican Party faces to broaden its appeal or to suppress the vote. The Republican Party has clearly decided not to broaden its appeal. Thus, it is forced to attempt to retain power by any means necessary. This must be its top priority. In other words, the immediate threat to its power is the resistance, including the Black Lives Matter movement, but the underlying threat is the changing demographics, which will govern future election outcomes as long as the U.S. remains a republic and has elections. Hence, the party must strive to kill democracy. Right now, the party is doing whatever it can to support Republican-controlled states' repressive voting measures. Trump is not even pretending that his aim is other than to suppress the vote. He's admitted that he opposes making it easier to vote because this would hurt the Republican Party's chances. When the Democrats attempted to insert voting reforms into a coronavirus relief bill, including the right to vote by mail, same-day registration, and early voting, Trump said, quote, "The things they had in there were crazy. They had levels of voting that if you'd ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again." And I have citations for these things. He commented on his government's support of a lawsuit to prevent mail-in ballots. He tweeted on May 28, quote, "Mail-in voting will lead to the end of our great Republican Party. We can never let this tragedy befall our nation," close quote. So everyone knows the party will die if people of color's voting rights are expanded or even just protected. So it seems the only solution to the Republicans' problem is the elimination of democracy. And we're not the only ones saying this. Some very well-connected former Republicans, respectable people, David Frum and Evan McMullen, have alleged that the Trumpites are willing to abandon democracy in order to stay in power. McMullen tweeted on January 30, where'd my tweet go? Somehow it fell out of my paper. Don't worry, I have it here. I want to give you the exact words that he said. Republican leaders in Congress believe and privately say that they fear the country is quickly changing in ways that may soon deprive them of power, and that they must use the power they have now to delay it as long as possible, even if harming the republic is necessary. Close quote. And David Frum delivered a Palmer lecture in 2017 in which he said, quote, "The special virulence and radicalism of Trumpist government, even as compared to its European counterparts, is owed to the junction between the fears of the Republican Party base and the claims of the claims of newcomers will displace their entitlements to Medicare and Social Security, and the nightmares of the Republican elite. Established democracies are most often toppled by their haves, not their have-nots. It's the fear that the poor might pillage the rich that turns the rich against popular government. Thus, people in the know are warning us that Trump and his party are ready to sacrifice the U.S. form of government and the rule of law to preserve their power. So it cannot be a surprise that they are turning increasingly to voter suppression and authoritarianism. And these elements of authoritarian rule are here and now in voter suppression. The Republican party must abandon democratic republicanism in favor of despotism and apartheid. This is the real and present danger which we need to name and fight now. In curtailing the vote, the Republicans are aided by the inherently undemocratic political structure of the U.S., which I don't have time to go into, but you can ask me. But the existing system of political power may well be insufficient to perpetrate the party. So the first line of offense to win Trump's re-election must be to stop Democratic voters from casting ballots. One way is to kill them, another is to frighten them away, and a third is to make it too difficult for them to vote. Trump is trying all three methods, engaged in seemingly inexhaustible attacks on the working class, particularly on people of color. For some of his latest practices, including the encouragement of foreign intervention in the electoral process, you can see many articles, including David Fromm's June 20 article in the Atlantic. Killing them off. Intentionally or not, Trump is killing off voters, disproportionately non-whites living in blue states, by allowing tens of thousands to die of coronavirus. People of color at 2 to 3 times the rate of whites. And we learned just yesterday that it was intentional. Additional deadly assaults on people of color and poor people come via the staggering level of unemployment, which will mean hunger, evictions, and sickness. Now that the stimulus checks have run out, and continuing attempts to end Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act are ongoing, Trump's encouragement of police murders and racist citizens' attacks on Black, brown, Asian, gay, and trans people, and his refusal to abate the dangerous environmental conditions that disable and kill poor people daily. Thus, Trump's deregulation of environmental protections and his disregard for human lives dovetail with the Republicans' desire to diminish the number of voters of color. Other methods of voter suppression. But the Trumpites can't easily kill enough Democrats to win the popular vote in the coming election. Given that they lost the popular vote in 2016, and the electorate is estimated to have grown since then by about 2%, mostly Latinx.
And 3 minutes.
More certain methods of preventing Democratic votes are needed. Ever since 2013, when the Supreme Court eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Republican-controlled states and elements of Congress have gone wild, killing off the mechanisms that used to guarantee the right to vote. Some of these state laws are patently illegal, but others less obviously so, especially now that the Supreme Court tends to uphold them. Closing polling places is a simple method that can make it impossible for many people to get to vote. In the June 23 primary in Kentucky, the state had fewer than 200 polling places open rather than the usual 3,700, and this affected mostly Black voters. Also, understaffing polling that produces long waits that people can't wait without losing their work or pay. Other tactics include purging the voting rolls on flimsy pretexts, as was done to Native Americans, and simply throwing voter registrations in the garbage, as was done in Georgia, and many other such tactics. Another Trumpite tactic may be allowing vigilantes to police polling places in search of, quote, fraudulent voters. They are fighting vote by mail and early voting. And of course, putting people in jail stops them from voting. And as Trump has been itching to do to the Black Lives Matter protesters, are the stormtroopers he sent to Portland meant to just scare the protesters off the streets or to actually lock them up? And will his stormtroopers be deployed to polling places in November to scare away Blacks and Latinx from voting? There's also Trump's attempts for the future to pervert the census so it doesn't allow proper allocation of representation and funding. He will undoubtedly attempt to pervert the Constitution. Excuse me. in ways that will reduce a possibility of people of color getting citizenship. In conclusion, the Republicans won't be able to win elections, assuming they continue to be the white people's party and assuming the people of color retain the right to vote and aren't simply completely disenfranchised. The demographics are the party's death knell. So the party must take desperate measures to hang on to power by undemocratic means. We face both long-term and immediate struggles if we're to defeat Trump and Trumpism. What will be Trump's next move? After all, before the election, he needs to create.
Time is up.
Okay. All right. Can I have 30 seconds?
Okay.
Okay. I just want to say the threat to U.S. democracy is real and urgent. I think Adam Plante is about to discuss why we must defend liberal democracy. And for Marxist-Humanist initiative, the opposite of Trumpism is not the Democrats, but rather a thoroughgoing social and economic revolution. But for that to become a real possibility, we have to deal with the immediate issue that confronts us concretely today: how to protect our democratic rights by smashing Trump's ever more dangerous efforts to defeat us at the start. Thank you.
So we just heard Trumpism poses a long-term and immediate threat to liberal democracy in the United States. I would like to talk about the ways in which a portion of the left has failed to understand and meet this threat, and then talk about why defending liberal democracy against Trumpism ought to be of vital importance to the left. First, let's get some definitions on the board. Nowadays, many people use democracy as a synonym for liberal democracy, and I will follow suit in this paper. I will define democracy as a process of selecting governments through popular elections, and take liberalism to be synonymous with constitutional liberalism. Constitutional in the sense that government is bound by the rule of law and the structure of and relations between its constituent parts are established in a framework, and liberal because the purpose of this government is to protect the individual liberties and freedom of its citizens, ostensibly. There is a style of politics on the left which is aloof to the threat which the global ascendancy of the far right poses, not only to the socialist project, but to humanity. This paper, situated within the context of the US, will argue that leftism, which minimizes the threat of anti-democratic politics, such as Trumpism, is reactionary in the face of the current political climate, that is, the ascendancy of the far right. Against this style of politics, I will argue that liberal democracy is not expendable, not just because of the human cost, which authoritarianism's rise implies and entails, but also because liberal democracy can play an important role in the struggle to reconstruct society along socialist lines. In fact, I will argue that even though democratic reforms do not necessarily imply the undermining of capitalist or bourgeois rule, liberal democracy is necessary to ensure that socialism can develop. We need to defend liberal democracy if we are to have a socialist future, or even want to have a future at all. A portion of the US left today is unable to face the present perilous situation. Instead of putting the goal of working towards a better society above their goal of seizing political power for themselves, they conflate mainstream Democrats and proto-fascists. Recent events may replace the word proto there. This sort of rhetoric only serves to normalize the far right and minimize the threat which they pose to humanity. I hope you heard what Jaclard just said about the Republicans and what they're planning for 2020 and beyond, on account of the objective situation of their increasingly limited avenues for holding on to political power. Let me put it this way. After Mitt Romney's loss in 2012, the RNC released an autopsy report, which repeatedly noted that these very demographic noted those very demographic changes and called for major changes in how the party addresses minorities and women. That was called the Growth and Opportunity Project. And just as a side note, Reince Priebus, who eventually, buddied up with Trump, was the RNC chair at the time. So that was back in 2013. But not, hardly 2 years later, on June 16th, 2015, Donald Trump announced his run for president, calling Mexicans criminals and rapists. Less than a month later, he led in virtually every single national poll among Republicans, from July 9th until he won the nomination. What path do you think that the GOP has chosen after what was called an autopsy? What's next? Reflect on the consequences of what Jaclard just said. I implore you. Okay. First, I would like to define what MHI means by the left-first political strategy of the anti-neoliberal left. By anti-neoliberal left, we mean, quote, tendencies that oppose neoliberalism while shirking from opposition to capitalism in all its forms. And by left first, we mean tendencies whose, quote, primary concern is to build the left and win victories, elections, campaigns, adherence, power for itself. This sector of the left does not put workers or the project of human emancipation first. They put themselves first. They do not call for common people to emancipate themselves and govern society because they regard common people as a constituency, to be won over in their own quest for political power. In other words, they're not fighting so that people can govern themselves, they're fighting so that they can govern others. Left first types want to seize the reins of capitalism for themselves and reform it in their own image. In light of this, there are two ideas I want to treat here. They are that there is no real difference, quote unquote, between centrism and fascism because neoliberalism causes fascism. And second, that voting simply legitimizes a corrupt and broken system, and so we should either vote third party or not vote at all. These are the arguments currently being touted by this sector of the left, among others. Much of the anti-neoliberal left argues that neoliberalism causes fascism. This position is exemplified in a piece which Slavoj Žižek wrote in The Independent shortly before the second round of the 2017 French elections, which asserted that, quote, there is no real choice between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. In other words, there is no meaningful choice between a neoliberal and a proto-fascist. His reasoning was that because centrism causes fascism, French voters should abstain from voting because the so-called, quote, cure is the very thing that caused the illness. In the article, no evidence is provided in support of the dogma that neoliberalism is the cause of the far right's current political ascendancy, but the underlying assumption is that the inequality allegedly caused by neoliberalism is the primary factor driving people to engage in far right politics. But there's two problems with that assumption. One, neoliberalism, which ascended to power in the 1980s, cannot be the cause of trends such as sluggish growth, rising inequality, rising debt burdens, etc., which predate it. And if you'd like to read more on that, you can read Chapter 4 of Andrew Kleinman's The Failure of Capitalist Production. And two, no evidence is provided in favor of the assertion that economic concerns are a major factor in the far right's popular support. In other words, even if the thesis that neoliberalism caused the economic downturns and economic trends that are associated with inequality, there's no evidence that that inequality is leading people to support fascism. It's not evident that that thesis is true at all. For example, the data on Trump's rise in the US clearly shows that economic concerns were not a significant factor whatsoever in his electoral victory. So why should we assume that this is the case in France, a country known for its consistently unpopular presidents in recent decades? And then there are the third-party fantasies and abstentionists. In a word, a vote for a third party in a swing state is one less vote against Trump, which is mathematically equivalent to a vote for Trump. Moreover, if Trump contests or attempts to suppress turnout in the election, the popular vote could really matter. Meanwhile, the perennial abstentionists are once again due to dust off their argument that voting offers us no real choice. It serves no purpose but to legitimize the status quo. Let's hear what Engels had to say about this idea in 1871. Quote, the political freedoms, the right of assembly and association, and the freedom of the press, those are our weapons. Are we to sit back and abstain while somebody tries to rob us of them? It is said that a political act on our part implies that we accept the existing state of affairs. On the contrary, So long as this state of affairs offers us the means of protesting against it, our use of these means does not signify that we recognize the prevailing order. Remember that word weapons. We're going to come back to that later. But if you call yourself left, and if the re-election of Donald Trump is just collateral damage to you, then your primary objective is not human emancipation. If the far right dismantling liberal democracy in the US and the human consequences that both implies and entails, as Jaclard demonstrated in the previous talk, are sacrifices you think worth making, you are digging your own grave and those of others. In reality, you are selling out your own professed agenda at the expense of empowering a right who will only undermine that agenda further. Do you sincerely believe that Biden will be worst on your self-professed concerns, such as Medicare for all, when the GOP has been waging war against the Affordable Care Act ever since its inception? Throughout the COVID-19 crisis, Trump has only seen an opportunity to dismantle Obamacare. You are no leftist. You provide material support to the far right. Get your head checked. We need to defend liberal democracy and the significant gains it has contributed to the socialist project against the war the far right is waging on it. As Jaclard noted, Trump's attempt to cripple democracy is necessitated by the demographic trends. So long as the United States is a democracy, relatively more non-whites means the loss of his grip on power. As such, his racist and xenophobic attacks are neither merely ideological nor merely an attempt to rile up his base. They're an attack on immigrants and non-whites. His responses to COVID-19 and the renewed fight for racial justice are further evidence of this. But democracy is not expendable. The human cost of the erosion of civil liberties and minority rights by autocrats will be enormous. My defense of democracy is not just negative, however. I'm not merely saying that authoritarianism is worse. I'm also saying that democracy has something to contribute to the socialist project. Democracy has a positive content, which is vital to enabling the socialist project to develop, and it is therefore imperative that socialists defend democracy against authoritarianism. Marx noted that, quote, the rule of the bourgeoisie places quite new weapons in the hands of the proletariat for the struggle against the bourgeoisie. While Lenin noted in 1905 and 1917 that democracy is of, quote, enormous interest to the proletariat, and that, quote, democracy is of enormous importance to the working class in its struggle against the capitalists for emancipation. It is essential to note that the defense of liberal democracy against far-right authoritarianism does not imply support for the status quo. In the July 2018 piece for The Nation, David Ost summarized this accusation as follows, quote, while liberals call for a united front to restore basic democracy, the left fears that this will only revive the neoliberalism that they think is responsible for driving people to the right in the first place, which again, we saw that we can question that. Remember, against the argument that voting legitimizes the status quo, Engels reminded us that democracy offers the working class new weapons with which to fight it, with which to fight against it. We just heard Marx say the same thing about bourgeois rule. Today, the defense of the status quo argument takes the form of asserting that the status quo, by which these people mean neoliberalism and not capitalism, has caused the ascendancy of the far right, and that therefore fighting the far right is tantamount to defending and exacerbating it. As we saw, it is dubious that neoliberalism has driven people to the far right in the US. More to the point, defending democracy does not mean that I see it as an end in itself. Each time that Lenin said that democracy was of enormous importance to the working class, he was careful to remind us that democracy is not in itself sufficient to undermine capitalism, nor is it, quote, by any means a boundary not to be overstepped. While it is true that radical movements are not as tolerated as movements which stay within the boundaries of bourgeois society, it remains undeniable that in liberal democracies, dissent is tolerated to a greater degree than in more authoritarian forms of government. The freedom of association and the press, the rights of the accused, protections from unreasonable searches, the right to a speedy trial. Without protections like these, there's little hope of an independent, revolutionary self-development of the working class. Without these protections, we can expect arrests, incarcerations, firings, expulsions, exiles, and even executions to become the norm. To the extent that there could be a working class mass movement under such repressive conditions, it would be constantly facing enormous strain. Bourgeois right may be limited and imperfect, but it certainly gives radical movements more space to grow than governments which suppress dissent across the board. Democracy, though inadequate by itself, is also a precondition for the achievement of socialism in another way. In 1875, Marx wrote that, quote, "It is precisely in this last form of state of bourgeois society that the class struggle has to be fought out to a conclusion." Because, as he wrote in 1848, in the existing bourgeois societies, quote, "The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class, which is the battle of democracy." Marx is not rigidly stagifying the steps of the revolutionary process here. Rather, he is saying that bourgeois democracy provides the working class with weapons that it can fight for its political ascendancy with. In other words, democracy is a platform upon which the working class can fight to develop socialism. In conclusion, it is imperative to defend the liberal democratic concessions, for which the world historic movement of the working class has frequently fought and died to win even partially. Fought for and died to win even partially. Democracy is not expendable, not in the least because minority and workers' rights are not expendable, because working people and minorities themselves are not expendable. Non-whites especially are exactly who are expendable to Trumpism. Indeed, Jaclard just spoke about how they are Trumpism's biggest obstacle. We see here that the fight for worker and minority rights needs to extend to struggles to defend liberal democracy. And as I've shown, the proletariat needs these protections, or they will no longer have any protection during their struggle for human emancipation. Again, I'm not saying that we should simply reinstate basic democracy, as David Ost put it, or return to the status quo. I am saying that the fight against global authoritarianism on the platform of bourgeois democracy is an opportunity to develop new ideas, new forms of organization, and new human relations. The battle to defend democracy against authoritarianism is a moment in the dialectical movement of world history. But that moment is needed urgently right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Ravi, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Hi. My paper's called Trumpism, Labourism and Nationalism. I want to look at how Britain has a similar problem, though not as acute, to the United States, with a Trump style of nativist reactionary politics. I'll argue most of the differences between the two countries are down to Britain being the former leading world imperial power, while America is the current leading world imperial power. I will also argue that the social democratic alternatives of Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders failed to confront this reactionary nativism and thus fall far short of being any effective opposition to Trumpist xenophobic reaction. So the first section is called The Rise of Anti-Chinese Racism. So Chinese communities have come under racist attacks in both the US and the UK in the wake of aggressive attitudes of our governments in relation to China over the coronavirus pandemic. The national imperialist mentality has been, in different ways, a very important, sometimes dominant component in times of sharpening international tensions. The rivalry between imperialist nations often takes time to be expressed as a hostility towards the people of the rival power. You can see the increasing tensions between India and China, as China killed 20 Indian soldiers, and within weeks India retaliates by banning TikTok and other Chinese apps, which have a large portion of their users located in India. It's 15% for TikTok inside India. Early on in his presidency, Trump started a tariff war with China and later went on to blame China for many of America's problems, including the spread of the coronavirus. Trump has announced yesterday he will also try to outlaw TikTok within the US. In Britain, racist attacks against Chinese people have, in some reports, been linked directly to Trump's rhetoric of the coronavirus as the Chinese virus. You can see the Financial Times report from April the 7th this year for a full outline of that. Trump has pushed the conspiracy theory that the COVID-19 virus was engineered in a Chinese lab and also forms part of the discussion amongst fringe right elements in the UK, it does not unsettle these racist conspiracists that the scientific opinion has poured doubt on their claims. Even if the story of an engineered virus had turned out to be true, it does not make sense that people of Chinese extraction, many living in the UK for generations, would be held responsible for the actions of the Chinese government. The idea of fifth columnists or sleeper agents is a trope that has often been used to justify racism in the past. In Britain, the national imperialist outlook is also most clearly articulated by figures on the right. Nigel Farage, formerly leader of UKIP and more recently head of the Brexit Party, has explicitly backed Trump's get tough with China approach, arguing that China should be made to pay reparations to the world. Former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith has echoed Trump's talking points about dependence on China through our level of imports and the need for balancing trading arrangements, much like Trump's fair trade, not free trade mantra. Former Tory leadership contender Michael Gove made provocative statements about China's culpability for the COVID-19 pandemic by saying they had not made clear how dangerous it was. There's been a new campaign group set up inside the Conservative Party to debate policy on China. This group, going by the name of the China Research Group, models itself on the anti-EU group, the European Research Group, that was headed by Jacob Rees-Mogg and represented the most Eurosceptic elements inside the Parliamentary Conservative Party in the run-up to the vote on Brexit. And recently, following an intervention by Trump, the UK has rejected the previously agreed deal with the Chinese company Huawei for setting up the 5G mobile network in Britain, in which Huawei are the world leaders. I mean, this can be understood as the standard economic and political jockeying between rival imperial powers. The problem is the conflict between national capitals will not remain at an economic level forever, nor will it be restricted to those countries alone. The knee-jerk blaming of the outsider is part of the mindset in an imperialist nation. The mode of thinking that identifies with the chauvinism of the ruling class has been there within working people for over a century in Britain. Nationalism in an imperialist country, since it is the identification with a state that dominates other countries, or at least tries to, will tend towards chauvinism. For people living in an imperialist country, the stronger the pride in what your country represents in the world, the more likely it is that you will be hostile to people of lesser nations. It also manifests as hostility to those who live amongst us but are seen as importantly different. Britain, like America, is a country in which national chauvinism is a major problem. It's worth looking at how imperialism emerged as a new stage of capitalism and how it affected working people in Britain and changed their relationship to the state. This next section is the expansion of the British Empire and the growth of chauvinism. It's worth remembering that prior to Britain becoming the biggest imperial power in the world over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, it is important to know that the working class were not regarded as patriotic and had to be press ganged, i.e. forcibly kidnapped, into serving in the armed forces, because there was never enough volunteers to fight England's and then Britain's wars. In fact, the ruling class were continually vexed that workers had no sense of patriotism. Establishment figures disparagingly called workers the international class, in contrast to people like themselves who looked out for the nation. The transformation in the outlook of workers took place during the reign of Queen Victoria. The wealth of the empire from the colonies was used to bring the union leadership into a close relationship with the government and employers, and gave the aristocracy of labour, as Marx called them, a stake in containing any class conflict. The British state successfully integrated the trade union bureaucracy as a leadership element within the working class movement into the management of class relations during the expansion of the British Empire in the final quarter of the 19th century. The union bureaucrats also acted as an important conduit for nationalism and chauvinism into the broader working class. As long as workers in Britain saw their interests bound up with empire and those of their employers and political leaders, then chauvinism towards foreigners and outsiders became much more widespread too. Unions played an important role during the two world wars of stifling labour unrest in the cause of assisting Britain's war efforts. It was the union leaders who first started to identify cheap foreign workers used by employers to undercut the wage rates paid to all workers that were involved in the building of infrastructure for imperialist Britain. The emphasis of the union leaders in relation to the Irish workers as foreign rather than cheap meant that they did not encourage a fight for decent pay and conditions for all, but rather called for an exclusion of these foreign workers. The Labour Party from its inception was a patriotic party with a nationalist orientation to do what it could for working people within the framework of making British capitalism work. The Communist Party, with the same social base within the trade union bureaucracy, also came to see the interests of workers tied to the fortunes of British capitalism. The more radical left that long rejected nationalism and chauvinism has only very recently, during the Brexit process, come to fully accommodate to nationalism. Brexit was a key turning point when much of the left balked at confronting the nationalism that has been strengthened in British society and instead tried to give what was a nativist reaction a radical or democratic twist. I am not arguing the EU is democratic. In many respects it is not. However, if the objection is to an undemocratic and bureaucratic set of institutions, then it is best not to pander to the idea that money subsidising poorer countries is a monumental waste, or that allowing the population of other European countries to be able to come here as an EU right of free movement is somehow problematic. This next section is the criticism of Fortress Europe is a fig leaf for Brexiteers. The EU, while allowing freedom of movement for its citizens between EU member states, does rigidly and brutally close off its borders to those who flee to Europe from outside in order to escape conflict, persecution or poverty. This is a barbaric policy that sees many desperate people turn back or allowed to drown in their efforts to get into Europe. There has even been prosecutions for boat captains who come to the aid of those in trouble on the water when those at risk of drowning did not have the required papers for entry into Europe. If the welfare of refugees and poor migrants was the concern of Brexiteers, they would confront the very widely held prejudices amongst British people that immigrants cause problems. Some on the so-called left even claim that it is not racism that motivates hostility to immigrants, but just the numbers that will be competing for resources and jobs. This misses the rather obvious point that racism can be motivated by a resentment of immigrants as an economic threat, whether that is real or just perceived. The sense of patriotic nationalism is not always overtly jingoistic. Sometimes that nationalism can take a more liberal form, such that tolerance is celebrated as a national virtue when it runs counter to reality, even when it runs counter to reality. British nationalism is often presented as a patriotic pride in a tolerant country that does not have the problems of racism in the way that America or many other European countries do. This sense of pride in a country, when it is also a major imperialist power, necessarily has to be selective. British patriots will point out we were the first country to stand up to Hitler and the Nazi expansion across Europe, but less acknowledged is that it was led by a racist imperialist, Winston Churchill, who himself was a part of a ruling class who were openly prejudiced towards Jewish people. Britain since the Second World War has presented itself as a multiracial country that has welcomed people from all over the world. This development was a matter of expediency when Britain needed cheap labour to rebuild the country after the war. The truth is that Britain brought cheap labour from its former colonies populated by non-white people. Britain then used a system of immigration control to enforce a second-class status for those people who, due to their skin colour, did not look as though they belonged here and were barely tolerated, never mind treated as equals. Progress has been painfully slow. Britain has improved its treatment of its non-white subjects, and like the belief of well-meaning liberals throughout the history of capitalism, this is treated as evidence that racism is a temporary situation that will eventually be reformed away. There are, of course, those who are more deeply imbued with racist nationalism and who feel threatened by Britain becoming more liberal and diverse. And then we have a younger generation who are considerably less racist than previous generations, many of whom have been radicalized by a more militant form of anti-racism as embodied by the Black Lives Matter movement, that's BLM. This next section is the response to the Black Lives Matter movement. The nationalist attitudes of those who see themselves as liberal can quite easily harden, as proved by the attitude to the huge youth turnout on the BLM protests here in the UK after the police murder of George Floyd. Even the name Black Lives Matter has triggered a reaction from those who otherwise see themselves as against racism. That a group would have the temerity to demand rights for themselves as an oppressed people makes some who might consider themselves liberal or even left to see it as divisive because it draws attention to skin colour. The mass anti-racist youth movement that sprang up in internationalist solidarity with the US protests against police murder is in many respects the absolute opposite of the nationalism and xenophobia of reaction that we see here. Those who have rounded on the BLM protesters or against the BLM platform of demands as identitarian are expressing a form of liberal nationalistic paternalism. For them, equal rights are something to be articulated, perhaps in a court of law by professionals, or in academic journals and articles, but not on the streets by angry youth who refuse to put up with this demonstrably lethal racism anymore. There is a place for lawyers and academics and journalists, but their roles are as important supplementary ones to the mass movement of people. Those who articulate White Lives Matter are expressing a nativist reaction to the anti-racist demands of the BLM movement. You will not find what these forces stand for in the literal meaning of their slogans, but in their social and historical context. BLM is a movement against racist police brutality. White Lives Matter is an expression of reaction from those who feel their identity and status threatened by the demand for black equality. That is their meaning in a social and historical context. That so many people are recognizing it now is a sign that something has shifted in society that presages an important potential upheaval in how we recognize each other as human beings. There is a great potential for BLM to continue to develop in a liberatory direction. It deserves our assistance and support. It should not need to be said that BLM is not the mirror image of the KKK. Now that every English football game starts with all the players taking a knee in support of BLM, this is not the conformity to a new religion, as some commentators have cynically claimed, but rather the expression of an idea whose time has come. There have been a large number of black and white people, sports people in the UK, who have voiced their support for BLM and the anti-racist struggle. We have also had pushback from different quarters. The Burnley fan who flew a White Lives Matter banner from a plane above the Liverpool-Burnley football match was doing more than expressing an identity claim. It was a reaction to the assertion of rights by BLM. Many white nationalists are feeling threatened by the insistence of the mostly youthful protesters that Black Lives Matter. The most visible show of force by the white nationalists were those who came out to defend the statue of Winston Churchill after it was daubed with the word racist at one of the BLM protests, and after protesters in Bristol had thrown the statue of a local philanthropist who had profited from the slave trade into the harbour. There is an element of the so-called left who gives succour to these racists by suggesting that racism is not systemic, when so many non-white people are doing so well. They will argue that BLM is black identity politics and tries to ascribe collective guilt to all white people. Don't Divide Us is a liberal initiative that triangulates between BLM and the racist far right and treats them both as trying to racialize society and undermine the good racial relations that exist in Britain.
3
This
minutes.
false
Ravi.
equivalence in the mirror is the mirror reflection of Trump's comments after Charlottesville that there were fine people on both sides. We instead have racists and anti-racists threatening our mythically good race relations in the UK. MHI have identified what we call Trumpist reaction as a global phenomena. The White Lives Matter is a form of Trumpist reaction. The criticism by liberals of BLM as a form of black identity politics is a form of accommodation to this reaction. These were themes developed in MHI's perspective document, Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation. What has become clear is that social democracy of Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn in this more polarized atmosphere is just not going to cut it. When there is a politics of xenophobic nationalism, as represented by Trump in the US, and in a seemingly milder form by Brexit here in the UK, a modest redistributionist politics, such as being put forward by Sanders or Corbyn, is not a real alternative. The economic populism of offering something to everyone, however desirable it might seem to those who buy into that vision, does not seem a credible offering to most people. When there is a refusal of the political class to give representation to challenging national chauvinism, and instead an economistic evasion of challenging that division is presented by the Labour Party as the official opposition, it is not an alternative that could inspire. The historic levels of defeat suffered by the Labour Party was a rejection of them as any alternative to Britain's natural party of government, rather than any enthusiasm for the Conservatives. Many commentators have framed it as dominated by a desire to get Brexit done. While this is a large part of it, the broader backdrop is the xenophobic turn in politics, and it is what the Labour Party was unprepared for. Even under the supposedly left figure, like Corbyn, Labour shared the same philosophical political ground of nationalism as the Tories. Labour was less convincing in projecting what their proposed course of action would lead to. Many on the left have been somewhat despondent about their prospects, given the political landscape here since the election in December. Then George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis while someone filmed it. The takeoff of the BLM movement in the UK represents a new element that is outside not only traditional mainstream politics, but also radical left politics too. It is internationalist in its concerns, anti-racist in its orientation, pro-LGBTQ in its platform, initiated by women, supported by youth, and has attacked the very roots of British self-identity, leaving you uncomfortable. It is a very promising start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, all speakers. We're now moving on to the discussion of the papers. Adam, what did you think about Anne's talk?
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about Jaclard's paper in terms of, I'm gonna summarize it and then talk about it in terms of how I was thinking about it. So, you know, I think it's really important that she pointed out that the Republican Party's actions are not an anomaly. They're doing what's necessary in order for the party to survive. And, you know, it's the changing demographics that they're really reacting against. And that's why that's a really important support that's really important support of the fact that the Trumpist threat is not going away anytime soon, because the demographic changes which threaten the Republican Party are not going away anytime soon, unless something dramatic like a complete stop of immigration or, you know, God knows what occurs. But I was really thinking about Jaclard's paper in terms of the RNC postmortem that I referred to. In that paper, you know, they cite the same demographic changes, and this was back in 2013 after Mitt Romney lost, and say, okay, how is the party going to move forward? Well, this paper argued that the party should be more inclusive, and they noted that, for example, many Latinxes, especially immigrants, are Roman Catholic. so they figured that they could appeal to them with social conservatism. They noted that Muslim immigrants may be a demographic who they could support. However, or who they could garner support from. However, that is increasingly difficult, of course, because of the reaction to 9/11 by the GOP, which caused Muslim voters to go further left. But instead of taking the advice of this paper and being more inclusive, the Republican Party in 2016 ended up going in the other direction towards white supremacy, which they were able to squeeze out at least one more win doing that. And this is really concerning, especially how quickly Trump was able to change the face of the Republican Party overnight, as I noted. Jeb Bush was in the lead. The Gang of Eight, the people who were trying to grant amnesty to immigrants were, some of the top contenders in the primaries. And almost overnight, Trump was beating them in the polls by a significant margin. And within a month, he was winning in every poll to this day in the Republican Party. And this is really concerning. And I think it's really important that we point out, number one, these demographic changes are not going away anytime soon. And that's why Trumpism poses a continuing threat. What happens in 2024, regardless of whether Trump loses or wins this year? Is Tucker Carlson going to run? Is Don Jr. going to run? Is Eric going to run? There's been a lot of talk of that. How are we going to face this threat in 2024? The Republican Party has chosen which side, which decision they're going to go with. Are they going to be a more inclusive party and try to, win more conservative immigrant populations over onto their side? Or are they going to be the party of white supremacy? It's clear what they've chosen. And, if Trump loses in 2020, there's going to be a battle for the soul of the party. But the Trumpite base and Trumpism are not going away because this sector of the Republican Party is not going away, nor is their support. And that's something that we really need to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, we'll have we have Ravi comment. No, I'm confused now. Ravi commenting on Adam's paper. Have I got this right? Hang on.
Right, you have, yes.
Okay, yes. Yeah. Go ahead, Ravi.
Well, I thought one of the most important points that Adam drew out was the false equivalence made between centrists and proto-fascists, and the whole idea that they are symbiotic, or even that the neoliberalism or the neoliberals give rise to the kind of far right into fascism, and that you need to pull the problem up by its roots. And obviously the issue with that is that the far right have emerged under lots of different conditions, not just neoliberalism, and that if you wanted to characterize capitalism as the problem, you can't reduce that to a particular kind of regime like neoliberalism. If you're going to go for the problem at its root, it means treating the capitalist system as a problem in and of itself, and treat it at a systemic level if you're going to go for the problem at its roots. I thought that was very interesting. I also thought the need to defend kind of democratic spaces and to the right to a free press, the right of assembly, due process, and trial by jury, all these things that we take for granted as just part of what makes a capitalist society tick. I mean, they are important spaces for us to be able to develop anything in a thoroughgoing manner, because obviously under repressive circumstances, it doesn't make socialism impossible, but it makes it much, much more difficult. And the possibility of self-development and for the open discussion of ideas about what kind of society we want and what the directions forward that we would need to go in, those are facilitated by having democratic spaces. And so the threat to liberal democracy is a threat to the socialist project as well. I thought that was very well articulated in his paper. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Now it will be my turn to comment on Ravi's paper. Now, it is always important to start with, start thinking or analysis with verifiable fact and information about the actual situation on the ground. And in this respect, I found Ravi's, Ravi digging a little bit into history, very illuminating. But Ravi also made very important conceptual points or theoretical points. And I want to comment or focus my comments on two of those in more depth. Now, the first one is about blaming China for or Chinese nationals for the coronavirus, and especially blaming Chinese individuals who live in the UK and hold them responsible for the actions of their governments. That is an example of a very deeply rooted problem, and that's the hallmark of nationalism and chauvinism, is that scapegoating, which means blaming others for society's problems, is very systemic. But blaming and negotiating, they do at best nothing to address the underlying problem, and at worst make matters worse. Now, and I think we've seen evidence, strong evidence, that doing nothing or doing too little too late really has bad consequences in the context of corona. And this is that Britain has the highest cases of death in the EU, and Britain has the highest number of deaths in the world. So the far right and the ones that are mouthing off against the Chinese, they should rather address the issue of protecting the people at home, rather than blaming somebody as a feeble excuse or attempt to distract from doing nothing or doing very little. So again, the important point is that scapegoating makes matters worse instead of addressing an underlying issue. And the second point I would like to focus on is that the working class globally, parts of the British working class have not emancipated themselves from their rulers. Now, Ravi presented examples from history in the run-up to the First World War, the nationalism that they were fighting, then in the Second World War, fighting the Nazis. But while this was very important, the issue with this is that the parts of the working class have aligned themselves with their rulers, and especially the chauvinism and the nationalism of the rulers at the time, which does nothing for the emancipation of the working people from their rulers. And this has meant that many and this continues to today. Part of the Brexit agenda, not all of it, of course, but part of it was driven by a sense of superiority against the other nations in Europe. And a big argument then was to justify this thinking was, Brussels they make the laws for us, and it's much better that the Westminster government makes the rules for the British people. But this does, again, nothing for the emancipation. It doesn't make a difference whether people's affairs are determined in Brussels or in London. The net result is the same. Some rulers dominate or determine the affairs of people. But what was very encouraging, I thought, in Ravi's talk is the in-depth discussion of the Black Lives Matter movement, especially that so many young people take on the ruling class's instrument of oppression, the police. They, young people in particular, also others that go on the protests, they fight racism, xenophobia, brutality, and this aspect of the movement cannot be stressed enough. Yeah. So this movement needs our support, because especially in terms of what MHI is trying to do, in terms of concretizing and developing theory, because without theory there is a danger that the Black Lives Matter movement, like so many before it, may be captured by interests to lead, as Adam has discussed, or by individuals, or by parties, or the movement might be captured in some form by capitalism itself. And when that happens, the movement will not achieve its goals or its aims, or fall short of, or may only achieve a little bit of their goals. Okay, I'll leave it here. We have a few minutes. If anybody wants to comment on the papers that they have not commented on, we can do this now. So we suggest we have a 5-6 minutes open discussion.
Should we do closing remarks too?
And we can then do closing remarks. Yeah. Okay.
I would like to comment.
Sure.
On the papers. First on Ravi's, he points out the opposition to the underlying ideas and force of the Black Lives Matter movement by some on the left who condemn it as identity politics. Now, identity politics is a dirty word to a segment of the left. I guess it means you're not seeing the whole picture, you're not seeing workers' oppression, whatever they mean by it. But Marxist-Humanists in the U.S. have always, and that's where the philosophy was born and developed, have always seen movements for self-determination of people as well as nations as extremely important, and as not in opposition to any other group, but as part and parcel of workers' movements and women's movements and youth movements. So it's sort of distressing that that old trope is still being thrown up by part of the left. And what I think it means is that that part of the left has to be defeated. Adam spoke a good deal about the reactionary positions that are the result of the left's ignoring the dangers of Trumpism. MHI condemned Trump before he was even nominated. We had an editorial in 2016 and we were laughed at. Oh, you're being alarmist. Oh, he won't be so bad. How do you know? And of course he was bad and worse. Everything we predicted happened, and the left should be apologizing to us and changing their ways. And yet there is, I don't mean the whole left, a segment of the left, there is still this opposition to being totally anti-Trumpist and to seeing that Trumpism has to be uprooted, because as Adam pointed out, again, how will we face the next Trumpist candidate in the next election? I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if we're going to need a civil war or what we're going to need, but unless this mindset that has been discussed in both the UK and the US is totally uprooted, we are in for a lot of trouble. So the point is to start fighting now, and to fight long and hard, and to bring theory to bear, as Ralph just said. Over.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, just a quick thing on something you said, Ralph. We in the UK we don't have the highest infection rate or death rate in the world. That honor belongs to the US.
Did I not say this? I apologize if I didn't say this. I thought I said in the UK the highest death rate in Europe.
And then you said in the world. Okay, I'm just
okay. Sorry. Yeah.
And then, but I think the whole way in which the politics of Brexit exposed people who have been like anti-nationalists for a long time, that the way in which they tried to make the whole nativist turn and that whole kind of drip effect of like British nationalism and the idea that Britain was still an important power in the world and that we could go it alone and we didn't need the EU, all that kind of tub-thumping nationalism, which people, that's what the Leave campaign represented. You can see that has actually strengthened sort of British nationalism. And even though lots of people on the left sort of try to make out that there's democratic elements to that and that it represented something positive, the further you get away from the referendum result, the way it's been explained back to people and the responses to the frustrations around Brexit and the way in which the Tories managed to get the vote they did and the way that the Labour vote collapsed, it means that you can put the kind of what Brexit represented in a much clearer focus and see it for kind of the reactionary turn that it was. I mean, it was obvious that was always an element, but the further we get away from it, the clearer that becomes, strangely enough. Over.
I would like to comment briefly on Anne's paper. Anne laid out the reasons why the world might be stuck with Trump for a while longer and the dangers this entails. So in my opinion, the situation the world faces is not only because the Republicans cling to power in light of changing demographics. In my opinion, another reason is because the Trumpist opposition has not unleashed enough pressure from below to keep the resistance going. We had strong resistance at the start against Trump, and then it died down somewhat. The main reason is because, in my opinion again, is that much of the left were actually soft on Trump and accommodated him, like we point out in the resistance to Trump's reaction and left accommodation. Yeah, this is, and as Anne says, this portion of the left needs to be defeated. Over. Okay, we have a few minutes for closing remarks. Would you take a minute to wrap up, each one of you? Adam, you suggested it.
Sure. I just want to end by reiterating that democracy is a weapon, and that's why the far right is trying to take it from us. And democracy had and still has its back against the wall. Every democracy index has been saying this for the last few years, that there's been what they call the democratic backslide. It's a global phenomenon. Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, so on and so forth. But since late May, there's been this incredible uprising in the United States, among people of color, among youth, and with a significant amount of international solidarity and international action. For example, I saw pretty early on in France that some of the protests in solidarity with Black Lives Matter were framing it in terms of local grievances that they had with police racism in their neighborhoods. And this has been really incredible. And, this is the only way forward I see. It's not going to be, some sector of the left seizing political power, implementing redistributionist programs, and then bolstering their power when people are thankful and vote for them, because this portion of the left thinks that those people will be obligated to do so. That's not the way forward. We need an independent, emancipatory self-development of the masses, and it's very clear that it's Black Lives Matter is a huge component of this, but very quickly it also became anti-authoritarian because of the fact that the police were being used to, to crush these people's right to democracy, to crush their right to assembly, to crush their right to free speech, quite literally to crush it. And this has been an incredible uprising. There's youth, there's students, there's women, there's an incredible amount of worker and international solidarity. It's race, it's racial issues, it's there's a decent amount of economic issues, especially during the pandemic, that have been woven into this as well, and a very healthy dose of anti-authoritarianism and anti-Trumpism. And this is very incredible. And this is the first time, I think it was either the EIU or the Freedom House Democracy Index report covering 2019 but published in 2020, which was the first time they noted, yeah, there's a backlash, but there's also a huge resistance against it. And this is incredible. The New York Times piece from, I believe, the beginning of June said that this isn't just the biggest American movement, mass movement in history, in American history. This is, even on the low end, 5 times as large as the protests in the aftermath of Trump's election. This is incredible. It's sustained. It covers almost all of the bases, and this needs to continue because democracy is a weapon, and something like this could not happen without it.
Okay, thank you very much. Anne, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Sure, I'll just say, yeah, I think that the U.S. resistance is alive and well. I don't agree with you, Ralph, that it's fallen off. It may have taken different forms. The form it's taking now is mostly the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been going for, over 65, 70 days, every day, hundreds of, if not thousands of cities all across the U.S. and other places in the world, little towns in the middle of nowhere, suburbs of New York, people who never marched before are marching or having car caravans because of the coronavirus. People are having marches in their cars. It's an incredible phenomenon, and that shows no signs of abating. And I agree with whichever of you said its persistence is one of its major characteristics that can't be dismissed just because the media may change where their spotlight is, doesn't detract from that. And it's a global phenomenon too, and it's not the only movement that's going on, but it spawned a lot of related movements. Rent strikes all over the country because people can't pay their rent. Mortgage strikes. Just I don't have time to mention all that. But I do want to say that all this is resulting, well, Adam just said this too, the self-development of the mass movements. It's not just one more issue, one more demonstration, or 1,000 more demonstrations. It's what's being discussed, what's going on, what ideas are going around, the fact that people are talking some about Marxism, a lot about socialism, a lot about black and white relations. Of course, there's a flowing of ideas that is not going to go away either. Now, I didn't say that Trumpism will always be with us. Au contraire. I said the Republican Party is going to die out, and that's a given. Will Trumpism reappear or continue to appear in other forms, very possibly. But it's not Trump or his family per se. It's this authoritarian streak that's in the US and apparently all over Europe, which is just losing its democratic forms at an incredible rate. And that's something that has to be uprooted, and that's a much bigger and more permanent project. So we need to work on that also, and not just talk about fighting the immediate goal, but we have to fight the immediate. We have to get rid of Trump. We have to get rid of the left that thinks it's okay to play footsie with Trump, even though he's killing hundreds of thousands of people. So we have to get busy. Perhaps a huge, humiliating defeat at the polls and huge ridicule by the rest of the world and by intellectuals and the media will shame him a little bit, or at least not shame him, he's incapable of that, but at least make more people see how serious this is and how terrible Trumpism is, and hopefully people will think some more about authoritarianism and rooting it out. Over.
Thank you, Anne. Ravi?
Just very quickly, I think people here who are saying that the BLM protests that have taken off in the UK are responding to something that is peculiarly American, and that we don't have the same level of police brutality that they have in the US. And while there's an element of truth in that, I think the more important point is that that expression of internationalism is really, really important. And the fact that people here have taken what happened in the US, and as Anne just said, have kind of launched from that and have been inspired by that to raise their own like local or like national grievances about the racism that exists in Britain, is a really important development, because it's saying that people here have common cause with people in the US, and you know that's the highest form of proletarian internationalism. That is the highest form of working class activity, and that's a really, really kind of important development for us to grasp in terms of something that has shifted in society. And although we are faced with a lot of shit with Trump and you know all the fallout of Brexit here and the Tories being in charge, all of that is true, but there is a new element as well, and that should not be underestimated. Over.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the panel. Many thanks to our speakers, Anne Jaclard, Adam Plante, and Ravi Bali, for all your interesting contributions, and also substantial contributions. You were watching part 2 of the Real Left Forum Marxist-Humanist Initiatives panels for in place of the cancelled conference. The name of this panel was is Marxist-Humanist Perspectives on the Life and Death Battle Against Trumpism. Do take a look at our website, Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org, which will also be shown in the description. And please check out part 1 of our video while you are on the website of the video panel entitled "The Poverty of Populism: A Marxist-Humanist Critique of Redistributionist Politics." See you on our website, and bye-bye.